So here it says, government lawyer Edgar Schmidt courageously blows the whistle. Even at the risk of his job, federal lawyer Edgar could no longer stay quiet on whether federal laws violate the Charter of Rights. Even at the risk of his own reputation and livelihood, Edgar couldn't stay quiet any longer. For more than a decade, the senior Justice Department lawyer has been trying to convince his bosses that they are breaking the law by inadequately evaluating whether proposed bills violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. When he was finally satisfied that no one would ever listen to him, he decided to sue the government. When we're talking about natural law, it's one and the same, the meaning, as natural rights. So you can say, I draw my rights from nature or from natural law. It's the same thing, same meaning. Now, natural law and natural rights became human rights and fundamental freedoms when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was brought into existence and the subsequent international covenants. They took natural law and natural rights, they combined them, if you will, and they came up with the covenants on human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, these natural rights, this natural law were to be contained, it was to be contained in the international covenants. So the expressions that found themselves in natural law or natural rights were to be brought forth into the international covenants. And now these international covenants would be a complete, if you will, expression of what man had decided that natural law would include. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 8, subsection point 2. No one shall be held in servitude. We're going to look at one very simple law, a natural right, a natural law that most will agree with and that we can't cause too much contention with, is that all men are free. We know, nature teaches us, natural law teaches us that all men should be free. Now when we look into the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in Article 8.2, we find the following sentence. No one shall be held in servitude. So the same expression of all men are free is coming out in the International Covenant, stating that no one, nobody, shall be held in servitude. Now if you understand what's transpiring here in Canada, here we have a sovereign, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. They title her or designate her the Queen of Canada. And they say that through a Pledge of Allegiance, through the Citizenship Act of Canada, that we have pledged to be faithful and to bear true allegiance to this Queen, to this sovereign. And that by doing this now, we are being held into servitude to this Queen Elizabeth II. So when you designate yourself a Canadian citizen, what you are saying is that you have pledged an oath, you have bared an oath, you have said this, or you have implied to have said this, that you will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of Canada, to her heirs and successors, and that you will faithfully observe the laws of Canada. You actually, by stating this fact, by making this oath, place yourself in servitude. So as a man or a woman, you are born free, you are free, and no one can force you or can hold you in servitude. Yet, through the Canadian Citizenship Act pledge, you have now made an oath that you will be a servant, you will be a subject of Her Majesty, of the Sovereign, and you will obey her laws, and you will give her your true allegiance. So, the whole point of this was to say that natural law is that men are free, and this has been contained in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There's many other natural rights or natural laws that have been contained in the International Covenants, in the International Human Bill on Human Rights. However, this is just for one example. Now, this article of law here that states no one shall be held in servitude, it must find its expression within domestic law in Canada. So Canada, because they are a signatory to the international covenants, as you're going to see shortly, they had an obligation upon them that these expressions of law, more specifically this one in particular, would find an application, would find its expression in domestic law through one of two things, through either the Constitution Act of Canada or through another measure. That's what the law says. But nevertheless, Canada, as a signatory to the International Covenant, had an obligation to bring forth this right within Canada's domestic law. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 2 and Article 2.2. It states, each state party to the present covenant undertakes to respect and to ensure to all individuals. Notice the player doesn't say person, but it says individuals. Within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction, the rights recognized in the present covenant. Now, Article 2, subsection 2, where not already provided for by existing legislative or other measures, each state party to the present covenant undertakes to take the necessary steps in accordance with its constitutional process and with the provisions of the present covenant to adopt such legislative or other measures as may be necessary to give effect to the rights recognized in the present covenant. In 1867, Canada had a Constitution Act. And in that Constitution Act, Her Majesty erected laws, or gave the ministers of Canada the power to erect laws on her behalf, in her name. This was the Constitution Act of 1867. Now, in 1867, there was no international covenants in existence, in play, in operation. There were no international articles of law that came against this Constitution Act of Canada. However, in 1976, Canada, i.e. Her Majesty also, became a signatory to these covenants. And the obligations, the rights and freedoms, that natural law, natural rights, which were inside these covenants, now place an obligation upon Canada. And they were not contained in this Constitution Act. So Canada had the obligation to, in 1982, to create a new Constitution Act. And they called this the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And this new Constitution Act was a fulfillment of their obligations from the International Covenant, Article 2.2, which said that this state party had to now implement all these rights and freedoms within their Constitution Act, or by another measure. And that's what transpired. So in 1867, Her Majesty, if you will, creates Canada. Okay? And in Canada, there's no international covenants, natural law, natural rights. There's no articles we can really point to say, these are our rights as an individual and we're standing upon them. So here, we are subjects and servants of Her Majesty. And don't let that escape you. This is a serious matter. You see, in law, your designation is that of a servant, is that of a subject, is of one who has pledged an oath to Her Majesty. And this is a binding power. This is a yoking power that is upon your life. It is a control mechanism that has been placed there upon your life. And they did it through declaring that you are her subject, her servant. Now, in 1976, international covenants come along, and hang on a second, no one can be held in servitude. Now there's a problem. Why? Because Canada is holding us in servitude. The monarch is trying to hold us as individuals in servitude to her by forcing us to pledge allegiance and claiming that we owe her allegiance to follow her laws. Now comes the international covenant, says no one can be held in servitude, places an obligation upon Canada. Canada must fulfill this new operation of law that says no one can be held in servitude within the Constitution Act of Canada. That's what they do. 1982, they create a new Constitution Act of Canada, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, to bring forth their obligation. So until 1976, if you will, it wasn't right. We were all being designated subjects and servants. Our lives were bound up by this. In 1976, an article of law, if you will, expressed a right that we can claim we don't want to be held in servitude. And that's what transpired. Now, most of us don't understand the fact that there's another operation of law available for us. That Canada, the Crown, Her Majesty, and her heirs and successors are under obligation to respect our individual fundamental human rights and freedoms. After this Constitution Act of Canada, what happened is that Canada made other laws. The Constitution Act of Canada in 1982 is considered the supreme law of Canada. Okay? And in Article 52 of the Constitution Act of Canada, it states that any other law that is created in Canada that is not in unity, that does not express the rights and freedoms in the Constitution Act of Canada, is of no force or effect. It's void. It's unapplicable. However, Canada, after the new Constitution Act, this supreme law of Canada, they make other rules, other laws, which are called enactments, if you will, or statutes, regulations. Look at it like rules. All this enactment, statutes, and regulations, these are rules governing actions, governing behavior. Now, these rules are supposed to be only applicable upon the subject and servant of Her Majesty. It is her, when you read these enactments, these rules, it says, therefore Her Majesty, with the advice and consent of the Senate and the House of Commons, enacts these following laws. So it's actually Her Majesty that is enacting these laws. And these laws apply to her subjects, her servants, these rules. Now, these enactments, these statutes, these regulations, they're supposed to follow, they're supposed to follow the rights and freedoms that are guaranteed in the Constitution Act of Canada. So there cannot, for example, we stay with servitude, okay? There cannot be an enactment, there cannot be a statute or a regulation that forces me and you as an individual to serve it, because that would be considered servitude. So this enactment that's being produced, if it places an obligation upon you, a legal obligation, a binding fact upon you, if you will, a binding matter upon you, then that's forcing you into servitude. And these enactment statutes and regulations, they only apply again to the subjects and servants of Her Majesty. They don't apply to an individual, to a human being, to a man and a woman. That's why, when I said before, you wake up and realize that being placed as that Canadian citizen as a subject in the servitude, that is really, really an important matter. That is really, really a situation that needs to be dealt with. Why? Because when they're applying the rules, when they're coming down now and saying, okay, this is what the enactment says we want to charge you here, this is what the statute and the regulations say, this is how we want to charge you with, these rules, they don't apply to me and you as human beings, as men and women. They apply to only the subject and servant of Her Majesty, that created artificial being in law, who's trying to walk around posing as us, if you will. So they consider us that legal person, as you've learned in my other videos, and that legal person is the subject and servant of Her Majesty, and that legal person must obey the rules of Her Majesty through these enactments. Now, again, we go back to the new Constitution Act of Canada, 1982, Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There's a whole bunch of articles of law. There's a whole bunch of natural rights and natural freedoms that have been incorporated, that have been placed into the international covenants, that trumps all these enactments, statutes, and regulations. The Constitution Act of Canada trumps the enactments, statutes, and regulations, but so does the international covenants. And Canada is very aware. That's why when you look in the new Constitution Act of Canada, Article 26, it states that here we've listed in the Charter certain number of rights and freedoms. But Canada doesn't deny the existence of other rights and freedoms that are not mentioned in this Charter, because they knew that there were a whole bunch of rights and freedoms still in the international covenants that were not being expressed in the Constitution Act itself, yet they had to let the doorway open, or leave the doorway open, for us as individuals to have access to those rights. That's why they specifically put Article 26 in the Constitution Act of Canada, so that when you and I, as an individual, went looking for our rights and freedoms, and we come across this verse, we say, okay, I understand. I can read certain rights and freedoms here in the new Constitution Act of Canada, but just because they've listed certain rights and freedoms, it doesn't mean that Canada is denying there is an existence of other rights and freedoms. Now, where do these other rights and freedoms come from? Do I just make them up out of my mind? Oh, I believe there's this freedom and I believe there's that right. No, they knew ahead of time that they were bound by the international covenants, and there were rights and freedoms being expressed in these international covenants that were not being brought forth directly in the new Constitution Act of Canada. Therefore, they applied Article 26, that if we would go looking, we would have our doorway, our access point, back to the international covenants. In the international covenants, we see that the provisions that are in the covenants, the laws, the expressions of law, the operations of law that are in these covenants, these provisions must find their expression in the Constitution Act of Canada, 1982. So Canada has that obligation. Oh, the international covenants say such and such. We have to express this right in the Constitution Act of Canada. So what they do is, they only now, when it comes down to making the Constitution Act of Canada, instead of including all of their obligations directly, so we could go and read them, let's say from the international covenants, they include, and I'm just giving you a numerical value here, this doesn't really represent how much they included, but they include 65%. And they leave 35% out, which are let's say the laws that deal more with individual fundamental human rights as men and women, independent from society based upon the principle of mutual benefit. So they leave those laws out, trying to hide them more. And they incorporate most of these laws here that have to do with a democratic society into the Constitution Act. They throw a little bit of the human rights and freedoms into the Constitution Act. Now, you and I come along, we get to reading the international covenants. Not only get to reading it, we get to understanding it, comprehending it. It gets to enter into our mind and into our heart, starts to take effect upon us, realizing that there are other rights and freedoms that we've never been taught, never even been exposed to before. Nevertheless, they are there for us. And we say, I wonder how we can use these rights. I wonder how they can have their way in my life here in Canada. We go to the Constitution Act of Canada and we start reading it and we see, well, hang on. Most of these rights are missing. These rights, these 35% there that I'm looking for, are not contained here in Canada. So we realize they're not contained in the Constitution Act of Canada. We could go right away to Canada and say, hey, listen, you failed in your obligation. Why? Because when I look into the International Covenant, I find provisions that are there, those 35% of provisions that you did not include in the Constitution Act of Canada. Now you're automatically in default. Your obligation has fallen. I can come right against you. They didn't do that. That's why they included Article 26. Specifically why? They said, listen, here in the Constitution Act there are certain rights and freedoms that we are enumerating. Let's say that's 65%. But we're not denying the existence of other rights and freedoms that are not enumerated, that are not listed in the Constitution Act of Canada. Those 35%. And it's up to us as we go looking for our fundamental rights and searching for them and searching for our freedom from this commercial system that we'll be exposed to all this and we'll begin to learn all this. But it's only when we as individuals start looking for a personal freedom from this entrapment that's been placed around us, from this certain life of servitude and bondage, because that's really what it is. We're paying taxes to Her Majesty for what? On our food. We're paying taxes to Her Majesty or to the social systems of Canada. That's what they tell us. And if you believe that one, then go watch my video here that's contained in my YouTube, and I'll show you exactly what they do with the money that they call taxes and where the majority of this money goes. But nevertheless, they collect taxes from your paycheck, claiming that it's for a social benefit. They tax you on gas, claiming it's to fix the road. They ask you to pay licenses and permits for actions that are lawful without permits. Again, take it a little deeper. I can't go now down to my municipal council or wherever it may be that you pay for your permits and say, yes, I'd like to have a permit today because I want to shoot my neighbor, for example. He's got me very upset and his actions that he's doing, and I'd like to have a permit to shoot him, please. They'll say, are you crazy? What are you talking about? You can't do that. That's against the law. And you're absolutely right. That is against common law. You cannot hurt anybody. You cannot kill anybody. You're not allowed to beat up anybody, or you'll be put in jail. Hopefully, that's common law. So that's not a lawful action. But there are a lot of lawful actions that we can do as men and women that don't take permits, that don't take permission from anybody, yet what they're trying to do is they're trying to get us to pay permits and licenses for these lawful actions. So, for example, it's lawful for me it's a natural for me, right, to be able to go and fish, catch a nice, let's say for example, bass, perch, whatever fish it may be that you like, to catch that, pull it out the lake and eat it. That's my right to do that. However, through their enactments on the subject and servant of Her Majesty, they're going to say for that right, for that privilege to get that fish out of the lake and eat that, we're asking you to pay money in the form of a permit. But that's a lawful action. You see, I can do it without the permit. I can do that. No one should be able to tell me anything. Hey, you can't fish. What do you mean I can't fish for myself? I'm not fishing to feed, to make $1 million in a commercial capacity. I'm fishing for myself to eat. And you're going to tell me I can't do that? Well, no, you can't do that without a permit. They're trying to regulate lawful actions. How? How are they doing that? When they render you that subject and servant of Her Majesty, then they create a rule that says that if you want that fish, then you have to pay for the permit. But what they fail to tell you is that that rule only applies to that subject, to that servant of Her Majesty, and not you in your natural capacity as a human being, as a man or woman. Again, I'll run through it just one more quick time. I can't go down to the permit department of whatever city it may be and say, hey, I'd like a permit please because I want to blow up my neighbor's house. To say, what are you talking about? Well, they've got me upset, and when they're gone I want to blow up their house, to teach them a lesson. And they'll say, that's unlawful. If you do that, you can be arrested and thrown in jail. They might even pick up the phone and call the police and say, oh, there's some crazy guy here asking me for a permit to blow up a building because he's mad at his neighbor. And I'm not mad, I'm just giving you an example. They can't regulate it. You understand? They can't say yes. They can't say no, really. You could go do it. Even if they say, I won't give you a permit. Okay, well, fine. You go home, you get whatever it may be, a stick of dynamite or create whatever you want, put it on the house and blow it up. They can't really stop you. Once they catch you, then you'll pay the consequences, and good for you. But you understand, they can't tell you no, neither. But they can't tell you yes. They can't give you a permit for it. Now, what they do for, when, let's say for driving, for example, if you think about it, okay, you have the right to travel. And I'm not trying to induce you to go out there and travel without a permit, without insurance. It's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm just trying to say that you have the right to travel. You have the right to go from one place to another place. And I would even dare to say that within natural rights, natural law, you have the right to use a conveyance of your choice. As long as you're not causing harm to anybody, that's your right. However, it's a lawful action, you see. And what they do is, then I'll say, okay, we're going to stop this lawful action of the man and the woman. We're going to make the subject and the servant pay for a permit, pay for a license, in order to allow them to operate this privilege. And they regulate a lawful action. That's what the government's trying to do. Create you to be that servant, make you play that role. Her Majesty enacts those laws, those rules, remember, the enactments, those regulations that apply to her servant, and they control you through those rules. And they get money, they get a monetary finance, a monetary blessing, by forcing you to pay for actions that are lawful, that are naturally yours to do, that are rightfully yours to do. So whether, again, if you want to go and hunt an animal, because you're hungry, you feed your family with the meat of a wild animal. I personally don't like that type of meat, but there's some people who do that. So they find a deer, and they shoot a deer. You need a permit, you need a hunting license, you need a gun permit, and all this in order just to be able to have that deer, to reap that deer, in order to benefit your life to eat it. Now that's a lawful action, that's a natural right that you have. The animals are here for us to use. You have the right to go and take that animal and use it to sustain your life. I believe that's why God has placed these animals here on earth. That's my belief. Others can say, well, we exist from the Big Bang, and I believe in evolution and God didn't create it, and I don't know why the animals are really here. I believe personally the animals are here to help sustain our life and here to help make our lives easier. So we have that right to eat it. However, what does the government do? The government, again, says, okay, you're a servant of Her Majesty. Her Majesty will let you, through an enactment, through one of those statutes, will let you have that deer. In order to eat that deer, here are the terms and conditions. You're going to pay for your permit, you're going to pay for your license, you're going to pay for your PAL, for your gun acquisition, for your hunter acquisition license. You're going to have a tag now, if you're lucky, from those draws. and you're going to shoot a particular one. And then once you fulfill all those obligations, then you can have that deer. And that applies again to the servant of Her Majesty. Now, in some ways, now this may take people as a shock, because I'm very much for human rights and fundamental freedoms. In some ways, and I've read a lot of these enactments, there are some enactments, whether they apply to persons, well, they do apply to persons, they are still good. I'm glad that they're there, for they are in some way protective of individual human beings, whether it be through losing property, being robbed, being attacked, whatever it may be. There are some enactments out there that help us and protect us. And they should have just incorporated those rights that they were trying to express in these enactments into the Constitution Act of Canada. But on the majority, 98%, okay, that's just a number, but on the majority, all of this has been created to tax us, to take our money from us, to make us into a monetary instrument for the government.